Good morning and welcome to our webinar at the Southern Africa Trust entitled Collaboration in Crisis Context, the Role of Intermediaries and Fiscal Hosts in the Civic Ecosystem. My name is Rachel Gondo and I am the Special Projects Coordinator at the Southern Africa Trust, and I will be moderating this conversation. Very exciting lineup of speakers and panelists, and hoping that you are all prepared to learn a little bit about how others are navigating the different shifts that are happening or have navigated in the past, and how civic formations, actors within the civic ecosystem are adapting and adjusting, and how to manage uncertainty. I don't want to preempt the speakers' inputs, but just a few notes for housekeeping. We have a Q&A feature. If you look at the top of if your screen is just like mine, if you look at the top, there will be an icon that written Q&A. Please may you utilize that if you have any questions along the way, please may you utilize the Q&A feature, and then we'll be able to address your questions as you populate them. We'll also be able to, if you are unable, you can always populate your questions in the chat feature. So I think we have enough to go, and we would definitely love to have you introduce yourself in the chat feature. Let us know who you are and where you're joining from, and we'll definitely feel at home in the conversation. So to start us off, we're going to have a small poll. We have a poll that we are going to be running. We have a few polls that will be running throughout the conversation. Hopefully you'll be able to respond. These are also ways in which that we would love to get your input to help and frame the conversation as we go. In terms of the speakers and the lineup of speakers, I will be introducing them as we go through the webinar. But I can quickly inform you that we have the CEO of the Southern Africa Trust, Aliness Kanengoni. We also have country managers from the Southern Africa Trust for Zimbabwe and Zambia, Ms. Janet Mudzviti and Ms. Aliness Mumba. We also have Dr. Siphosami Malunga, Dr. Joanne Harding from SCAT, and Ms. Lillian Tamale from Civic. We will then, after each of their ignitions, we will then have a little bit of time to reflect and stew on what they would have shared, and also share any of our experiences as well in the chat. I hope that this is good, and that we move on and we have the poll. I hope that you can see the poll. Can we have the poll set up, the first one, the first set of questions? With the poll, it's completely anonymous, and it's asking you how familiar you are. No, I think this is not the right one. But the one that's been administered is asking, yes, which of the following disruptions has your organization experienced in the past 12 to 24 months in relation to the shifting civic and funding landscape? Please feel free to select those that apply to you. Hopefully it allows you for multiple options. Once you've selected, you can just submit and then we'll be able to show the result. Okay. I hope you can also see the results on your side as well. So majority of responses have indicated that the biggest disruption that they have experienced in the last year or 2 years in relation to the shifting civic and funding landscape has been significant funding cuts or donor withdrawal. There's a bit of a gap, and it's followed by disrupted partnerships or programmatic delays, and then increased legal, political, or bureaucratic pressure. Thank you so much for your responses. I think we'll cut it off here. And I would like to hand over to the Chief Executive Officer of the Southern Africa Trust, Aliness Kanengoni, who will be prefacing the conversation for us. Alice, over to you. Please feel free to yes, I can see you.
Okay, great. I hope you can hear me as well.
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. And good day to everyone joining us this today. I almost said this morning, so I'm aware that some people may be sitting in time zones where this is afternoon or evening. So you're welcome to the conversation, and we thank you for making the time to join. So in the interest of those that may not necessarily be familiar with the work of the Southern Africa Trust, we are an independent African organization that is 20 years old. It is actually our birthday this year. We work in 16 countries in Southern Africa, all the 16 countries that make up the SADC region. And our mission is really to end poverty and inequality in the region. So we work at the intersections of gender justice, climate justice, natural resource governance, economic and care justice, as well as meaningful youth engagement, primarily in Southern Africa. And we support and resource others and also lead advocacy as part of the civic formations ecosystem in Southern Africa. So one of the pathways through which we do this work is mobilizing and re-granting resources in the social justice sector. But we also offer fiscal hosting services, that is receiving and managing strategic grants in partnership with a wide range of civic formations in the region. And this includes formations that are organized and registered, for instance, your community-based organizations, your NGOs, regional organizations, and so on. But we also work with formations that are not necessarily registered in the traditional way. And so these include, for instance, your social justice movements, your networks, your coalitions, amongst others. And so because it's two decades now of our existence, and when we were established 2 decades ago, the ambition and the belief was really just simple, a belief that poverty and inequality in our region could be ended. And today, which is also the reason why we are having this conversation, as we celebrate our 20th anniversary, we are faced with a question that I'm sure is facing many others in the sector. And the question is, how we will define the next 2 decades of our work as we are witnessing the end of aid as we know it. And it's a question that has come up in many spaces. I've been in a number of spaces in the first half of the year where this particular question, are we witnessing the end of aid and donor funding as we have known it, has been the key question anchoring conversations. And we are hoping also that it will be a key question that we can grapple with in this space, but more importantly, also look at the role of fiscal horse, and I would not want to call ourselves intermediaries, but local funds. Yes, we are referenced as intermediaries in other spaces, but we want to think of ourselves as local funds. And it is important, I think, to be asking that question because we do believe that, there is a special and a specific role that we ought to be playing, especially in this moment. So I'm speaking to you today, not just as a representative of the Southern Africa Trust, but really as a partner in what we call the civic formations ecosystem. And this is a very deliberate framing that we use at the Southern Africa Trust to refer to traditional civil society organizations, but also thinking beyond traditional ways in which the civic space is organized and how formations have carved space for themselves in that sector. So we are talking about, the cooperatives in rural communities, the youth movements demanding climate action, the women's giving circles providing social protection where states have failed. These are the formations that are truly anchoring social change across the 16 SADC countries, at least from our experience working in this region. And this framing is very, very important for this particular conversation, as it also challenges us to interrogate how the ecosystem is, how it has been shaped up, who is contributing in what way and with what effect, especially in a context where we've seen also drastic shifts in the last few months. So right now, civic formations across Southern Africa are caught up in what some have aptly labeled a perfect storm. And I think I will flag a few patterns because I know that I have very limited time, but I will flag a few patterns that I also hope will be part of the conversation today in this platform. First, the funding crisis is very, very real and it's targeted. And I think we can all attest from having looked at the outcomes of the poll that Rachel ran earlier. So the funding crisis is real and it's targeted. So we see gender justice, sexual and reproductive health rights, HIV and AIDS, climate justice, the very issues our communities need to be addressed the most are being systematically defunded. And I think it is important so that as we talk about, a sector where there is funding cuts, we also keep at the back of our minds the fact that it is very targeted. And it is especially those sectors and those issues that are most important for us that we see also being systematically defunded. It's not by chance that these particular ones find themselves being defunded. We really believe that it is very, very systematic. So it is also not just a funding problem. It is also a resilience challenge with 4 critical dimensions, and I will quickly run through those dimensions. So yes, it is. We see budget cuts and posing challenges for funding in the social justice sector, but there is a big question around resilience, and that question has 4 key critical dimensions. So first, there is a challenge around institutional resilience, which we see as being cracked, and it's cracking and it's crumbling. And this is the ability really to attract and retain staff and build stable, sustainable organizations. We see organizations are hemorrhaging staff. If you look at the outcomes of that poll, you can clearly see that a number of organizations have lost funding, and the result has been a forced hemorrhaging of staff where organizations and formations are trying to streamline operations to survive. So how do you pursue and build sustainable change when you can't retain the people who actually know the work? How can formations retain levels of vibrancy that keep important social justice issues on the agenda? These are the critical questions we are hoping we can begin to grapple with. And we know that, in many, many spaces, these are the questions that are also being put on the table. So we are keen to hear your take on how some are thinking about this. The second is financial resilience. which is really also falling short for many, many formations. And by this, we mean the ability to attract and effectively deploy adequate financial resources to finance the work and the plans of the organizations and formations. So civic formations are trapped in short-term funding cycles, while the systems change work we desperately need requires decades of consistent engagement. So we are being expected to kind of sprint through a marathon. And how do we do that? How do we think about working around and navigating such a dynamic? And I'm hoping that this is also part of the conversation that we can have today. And third is really challenges around mission resilience, which is under attack. And here we are referencing the ability to sustain the core mission of formations and organizations and entities in the face of competing funder and sector interests. In a context of increasingly shrinking civic space, with laws and regulatory frameworks tightening, organizations are forced to choose between staying true to their mission or just doing what they need to do to stay alive. And again, that is a critical issue to be talking about. And then the fourth dimension in the challenge is really technological resilience, which is a pipe dream for most civic formations on the continent and in our region. And this is the ability to keep up with fast-changing tech developments that are necessary for the work. We see that the world has gone digital, but many of our civic formations are still operating really with outdated tools in a context where technology is changing faster than we can adapt. And often the resources are not even available for us to be able to adapt and to catch up and so on. So how do we navigate such, and what role can fiscal hosts and local funds play in plugging some of these gaps? So the stark reality is that these challenges, colleagues, are really challenges that also impact various communities differentially. So we know and we've observed that these challenges are impacting women, girls, youth the hardest. And the very organizations advancing inclusion, gender equity, are the least funded and are the most vulnerable, especially in this current moment of our funding cuts. We are therefore not just talking about funding cuts and shifts in resources in the sector. And it's an important point, I think, to flag. We are actually talking about whose voices then get silenced first in such contexts. And I'm also hoping we can have insights around how funding mechanisms and vehicles such as fiscal hosting can be alive to these gendered impacts and play a proactive role in securing the voices most at risk of being completely shut down. And I think what I also just want to flag is that the challenges aren't new. It's not like we woke up and we found ourselves in this situation and it's new. The challenges are not new, colleagues. They are structural and they are historical. They are rooted in centuries of aid and donor funding architecture built on power asymmetries, on assumptions about capacities of those doing the work in the sector, especially in the global majority region, about partnership models that often also have not been truly partnerships in the true sense of the word. So the challenges are not new. The current crisis has simply ripped the band-aid off wounds that were never really properly addressed and healed. And the moment simply demands that we face that reality and address it in ways that challenge us to think, to do, and to be different in how we contribute to the ecosystem and to the sector. So what's the way forward as I wrap up? We need nothing short of systemic transformation, in my view. And how will that come about? I think we really need to have conversations around how we move from dependency to wealth creation. African civic formations must transition from donor dependence to wealth creation strategies. We need social enterprises that offer longer-term sustainability beyond donor funding and donor cycles. And second, we need to embrace ecosystem approaches because interconnected crises require interconnected responses. We must fund and work across sectors, recognizing that climate justice, gender justice and economic justice are inseparable. They are actually multiple sides of multiple coins. So if I may put it that way. And we also need radical restructuring. Sometimes transformation requires radical steps like declaring certain funding unacceptable based on shared principles and shared values. And we must reconstruct the power architecture of our sector. And what is the role of fiscal hosts and local funds in that core? This is where I really think fiscal hosts and local funds like the trust and others become crucial. We are not just financial conduits, and we should not. And I think if we should even think of ourselves not as such, but we are system disruptors. We provide fiscal hosting for both your traditional registered NGOs, but also for unregistered social movements, because we believe no good idea should die because of bureaucratic barriers. We must go further than that. We must also challenge the contradictions in our own accountability structures, deconstruct how we've been positioned in the civic architecture, build new models that share power with the communities we serve, and extend services to non-traditional CSOs. So for me, the question isn't really whether we can even afford to transform. It's whether we can afford not to. And the funding landscape will continue to shift as it always has. Political winds will change as they always do, and geopolitics will continue to shift. But the communities we serve will still need justice, dignity, and hope. So the choice is ours as I close. Do we adapt to survive, or do we transform to thrive? And my take is that we need to adapt, and we do have a critical role in that adaptation process as fiscal hosts and local funds. And in this platform, we will hear, I'm sure, from fellow panelists and resource people about how we can collectively turn this moment into the catalyst for the transformation our sector has needed for decades. Because 20 years from now, I would really like to be on such a platform and not be celebrating our survival, but celebrating how we fundamentally changed the game. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice. Very thought-provoking. And I think you really prefaced it well, and actually just setting up the conversation by actually surfacing that what we are experiencing is not new. And I think for the purposes of continuity and flow, I definitely like to call upon the country manager for Zimbabwe, Janet. Please, may you come in and also feed into the conversation as well, especially from your contextual experiences. Janet?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel. And thank you, Alice, for giving that preface and for giving us sort of a global overview of the crisis that we are facing. And my role is just to share from a contextual perspective, living and, of course, working in Zimbabwe, and which is where I'm sitting, as I have experienced as well in the sector, the different shifts that that have been experienced in the recent past. And as Alice rightfully said, what we have experienced in the first and second quarter probably of this year, or half of this year, is really not new, because these are the structures and systems that we have been working to dismantle, I would say, if I may use that word, as civil society, as civic formations in Zimbabwe locally, but globally. Pan-African movements have been speaking out and have been very vocal around the structures and systems that are very disempowering and that have perpetuated either patriarchy, racism, colonialism in its different facets or models that in some ways have come as extractive models, as economic models or political models that we have adopted and have not worked actually for us. And as I just have been reflecting on the shifting landscape, and of course we'll come to the role of intermediaries, but also collaboration from the Zimbabwean perspective and experiences of most civil society players in Zimbabwe, the the landscape has not just been shifting, I would say. It has, in some instances, actually fragmented um, and reassembled as well in other ways that have been visible. But there is a deep undercurrent of what will be happening. So it may sometimes appear or be experienced as a funding shift, but they are deep, like political, economic, social, and then the geopolitical issues and currents that will be moving visibly and sometimes invisibly, but all colliding at once, if I may put it that way. And it has been over 3-4 decades of that kind of experience, as it just depends with actually the time. So at one time it could be like such a democratic deficiency and deficit, and civil society tackles that, challenges that in all its formations. It could be faith-based, it could be those in the human rights and democracy, it could be those in the debt movement or tax justice movement, and it evolves in that way. In one phase, it is a pandemic and it's a crisis, and it's felt in different ways, maybe priorities shifting. In another, it's a climate crisis. So it has always been fragmenting and reassembling in some sort of way, but happening at the same time. But the key changes that have been experienced, and I thought I would share just as we reflect on the recent past, but broadly within the context. One is around the political transitions and and adaptations that Zimbabweans, that civil society have had to cope with for the past 3 or 4 decades, so to speak, if I may use that. So depending with the phase, the experiences have been different, but what is very clear is consolidation, of course, of executive power of the elites, the securitization of civic space, or erosion of actually independent institutions or institutions, and how political and civic actors are splintered, yet the elite, or if I may say the political elite, remains intact and backed by the military and also resource capital that we have seen. I'm sure there have been studies, there have been researches and analysis of even the advent or the emergence of sort of a deep state that has got resources and play a big role in the economy or in the business sector. This has caused the second issue of the shifting landscape for civil society, or the fleeting landscape that we have to always be grappling with, is the economic fragility and the extractive growth. And Zimbabwe's economy is sort of a story of a permanent crisis. So you talk about lack of stable currency, you talk of inflation, the currency collapse, debt, the debt question that has not been resolved despite different strategies being put in place by different even political administrations that have come, if we are using like the electoral cycles, but also the extreme informalization of the economy, where we have seen as well civil society having to come in either to challenge the structures, to challenge the systems, but to actually intervene with service delivery in some instances, where we have seen like civil society being involved in drilling of boreholes, in humanitarian responses and all. Then the extraction really which is one key point as well in the economy, particularly around strategic minerals. But on top is the issue around gold, around lithium, and land is a big question, which has been accelerating for the past over 3 decades. But communities being bypassed in all that, and the new elite economy actually thriving. And I think I've spoken to this. But state policy remaining very unpredictable and elite serving, if I may put it that way, because of the dominant narratives around the models that have shaped how we live, that has shaped how we engage, how we interact, even on a day-to-day basis, even at a civic sort of level. And this has undermined inclusive development. So it's a big question, a big elephant in the room, and also a very shifting, fragmenting, flitting sort of landscape that that seeks for us to reflect and to say how are we going to even address these sort of permanent crisis, as I have outlined, particularly as resources are also shrinking and probably interest and it being a priority really coming down. The third component, Rachel and colleagues, is around the closing civic space and legal repression of decades as well. But recently, and I was having conversations with colleagues that, the first half of the year of 2025, should we be considering that it has just been defeat? Looking at the geopolitics, the stop work, of course, the funding cuts, and then the laws happening locally. For example, the PVO Amendment Act coming into law and creating barriers and sort of being an attempt to silence civic voice, and saying it has almost been at the global level, we're being battered at the local level. A lot is also happening, and a sense, despair, desolation, isolation, even for some, as some civic formations actually had to close down. Some have been forced to sort of depoliticize the conversations. Social justice is about politicizing conversations, asking the critical questions, but to survive in the shrinking resources, there's been as well some sort of disengagement from structural critique as a survival sort of mode. The fourth one is, of course, the demographic shifts and disillusionment, where we see the youthful, the urbanizing population really being disconnected from this whole rhetoric that has gone on for years. And I want to believe there is some sort of a subtle values shift which is underway, where people have been talking transparency, livelihood security, and voice, and moving from the rhetorics of the past in terms of where we are coming from and the legacies. But I believe the funding landscape is really probably a strategic earthquake, if I may put it that way. I think Alice put an analogy of some sort as well. But for me, I think probably it's a strategic earthquake that I would say it should give us an opportunity to signal that we need to realign, we need to reimagine, we need to really think our interests, we need to think our ideology, what forms and shapes it, we need to think our geopolitical even loyalties, and really think where should our resources come from, what should be our new sites of hope, and what are also our the new sites or the sites of contestations that we need to interrogate and to work on, and how do we define a new agenda that centers the communities that we work with, that centers the different civic formations that have been trying to change the language from service delivery, from humanitarian to justice language. I think we began in 2025, for example, at the AU level, to hear about reparations as an example. How does that look like if we are in the development sector? What does it look like in the movements that we are building, in the new solidarity formations that are coming up, be they feminist movements, youth networks, informal workers, rural cooperatives? How does that look like, and how do we organize across those sectors and begin to interrogate even our own ways of giving as Africans, and at the Trust and Know we're working, for example, with community foundations? How does that look like? How does philanthropy, Pan-African philanthropy and our ways of giving look like? And how do we tap into that so that we remain with the agenda as we grapple with the poly crisis that we are talking about? Rachel, I'll leave it there, but I think it is really for us to reclaim language, speak of justice, reparations, the dignity beyond service delivery and resilience, even because sometimes it has also been very abused. You know, like in Zimbabwe, people say Zimbabweans are very resilient people, but where do we also profile that resistance? How do we support and give solidarity to resistance to the injustices within the system as it emanates in the structures and in the institutions that we have been saying we are building? What kind of institutions have we been building? And those are critical questions that we need to ask ourselves and say, where are the alternatives? Where are the locally rooted alternatives that will speak to all these issues? I'll stop there, Rachel, and give you back the mic. And thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you, Janet. Interesting reflections there. Thank you for also looking at it broadly, longitudinally from a historical perspective, and also just highlighting some of the key factors that, or rather key certainties or uncertainties that have affected the civic ecosystem in Zimbabwe. You spoke of the unpredictable environment, and also then emphasizing how this unpredictable environment has also then contributed to fragility in many different dimensions, even from a household, individual household, to even collectively as community and as a society and nation. Thank you for sharing the Zimbabwean side. Now I'd like to call upon Aliness Mumba, to provide us perspectives from Zambia.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Alice and Janet, for sort of prefacing some of our reflections globally, regionally, and within Zimbabwe. My sort of reflections sort of center around some of the adaptive approaches and adaptive sort of responses that we're exploring at the Trust when it comes to programming in this time of crisis. So we are cognizant of the fact that this funding crisis has created a lot of volatility around the funding space. There has been instability and disruption, strains on partnerships, and that has also put a lot of pressure on civic and political movements. So we're at the Trust looking at reflecting and reviewing how we program our work. And fortunately for us, we're in the second year of our Seriti strategy, which is a 6-year strategy that goes up to 2030. And in that strategy, a lot of what we're reflecting on now that would have been our responses to the crisis were embedded in our strategy already. So for instance, in responding to the funding volatility, we had already started shifting from project-based to portfolio-based programming. And we're having conversations with our partners around how we roll out and move away from just being project-based, but rather broad thematic portfolio-based. So at the Trust, we work across thematic spaces, for instance, climate justice, economic inclusion and justice, social justice, gender justice, and youth engagement. And for us, what that has allowed is that it has enabled us to be able to program long-term and short-term strategies, as well as short-term and long-term project windows. And so really we want to foster those kinds of conversations and reflections with our partners and in this region to be able to sort of help us respond to this crisis. And we're also having conversations with different partners around this idea of advancing core funding and shifting away from just project funding. But how do we foster a space where we have core funding and flexible funding, and we're engaging with different donors to be able to sort of have those conversations around that. And I think we're seeing that there is recognition even on the other side that there's a need for core funding that will assist foundational progress and foundational work across the ecosystem and across sectors, as opposed to a specific project-related funding, but rather core funding that speaks to flexibility, sustainability, and strengthening institutional operations and overall growth. And in responding to the disruption that we've noted, even among our partners, so the instability that we're seeing, we are again embedded in our austerity strategy, moving forward this idea of co-creation with communities, because for us, we strongly believe in co-creation. We are a decolonized feminist organization that really tries to sort of inculcate that in all of our work, and that's what we are driven by. And so in engaging with our partners and communities, all our programs are co-created, and so we are really trying to sort of push that that approach even with our partners. So we can share that recently we had a partners engagement in Zimbabwe where we noted that a lot of our partners are working in silos. And for us, this is also an opportunity to realize that now more than ever is not the time to be working in silos, but how do we co-create and sort of address the issue of strained partnerships and silo working, but strengthen civic formations to where now, instead of working in silos, we build on each other's work, and it becomes a layering of the work that we're all putting in and supporting in the ecosystem. So at the Trust, we're really having considerations and conversations around co-creating solidarity and equitable power sharing with our partners, with grassroots level communities. And again, it's this idea of, as an intermediary, how do we become the backbone of the smaller organizations that might not be able to sort of withstand this shift, who are like Janet and Alice have alluded to, are struggling, and we're seeing high staff attritions. We're seeing that some of them are just closing down. So really, I think this is an opportune time for intermediaries like the Trust to sort of step in. So we are looking into how do we then assist and facilitate the smaller CSOs to then become their backbone. And I think this is an opportunity, again, for us to reflect around how do we then, with this crisis that has befallen us, how do we then coordinate programming at a regional level or at an ecosystem level that reduces fragmentation and amplifies a collective voice? So again, it's really about building strategic collaborations and pooled funding mechanisms. And those are the kind of conversations and considerations that we are having at the Trust. And we hope that this, will go on and help us come to some sustainable solutions. And in terms of institutional responses, right? I mean, when challenges like this come up, they highlight some of the weaknesses that exist in our ecosystem. And one of the things that we have recognized at the Trust is that programs and projects will collapse under shock. And when that happens, it also is an indication that, certain times there are systems that would need to have in place that may not be readily existing. So for us, we are looking at how do we institutionalize crisis responses? How do we design that to strengthen institutions that we work with, but also within the system and within the ecosystem and within ourselves. And for us, what that looks like, what that could look like would be building flexible delivery mechanisms into program design. So contingency budgets, no-cost extensions, adaptable learning and monitoring processes and frameworks, building resilience indicators in addition to your outcome indicators. So as we're working in the communities that we work, are we really asking questions around, is there resilience being built? Are we doing enough to build resilience? And then also just working towards building rapid response windows. I mean, as intermediaries, we have an opportunity to design that in our programming so that we can deploy those within existing programs when challenges and crises arise. We're also looking at shifting our focus from just service delivery onto policy change and influence. I mean, I think a quick scan will show that when most people respond, most institutions respond to donor-funded projects, it's really sort of around service delivery, let's get it done. But how does that, feed into your broader programming and really focus on influencing policy and shifting and actually moving towards transformational change as opposed to just delivering a project and looking at outcomes. So for us, we're looking at evidence-based and evidence-informed advocacy, as well as policy dialogue where the voices of the marginalized are at the fore. So how do we then facilitate platforms and engagements where the communities themselves can come and share their lived experiences? So those are the kinds of things that we are working on at the Trust in terms of programming to respond to this crisis. But for us, like I said, it is fortunate that we had already positioned ourselves to where we are able to respond to these challenges that we've noted across the ecosystem, whether they are institutional or geopolitical. But those are the kinds of reflections that we're having at the Trust, and really just to sort of reposition ourselves and always keep at the back of our minds that as intermediaries, we are enablers of resilience, trust, and collective agency, and not just conduits for financial resources to different partners. Again, and we're also looking at how do we shift and decentralize decision-making and funding and move it closer to community-based actors. So really hoping that those conversations will continue as we engage across these issues in the region. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Aliness, and also for just reiterating or sharing some of the observations you've made in relation to how this targeted systematic defunding has affected the civic space in Zambia as well, but also then providing some ways in which, as the Trust, we are looking at adaptive responses, trying to be proactive, deploying mechanisms such as co-creation, pushing ourselves to think differently about how we collaborate at different levels, mapping out the different connections within the ecosystem, strengthening these ways of strengthening these, because as stated by Alice, it's more of it requires a systematic response, because the kind of cracks we're seeing require, they're multi-pronged, they're not linear, they're complex. So they require us to also be sophisticated in how we engage to or address them. I think at this point, thank you so much, Aliness. At this point, I'd like to then administer another poll. Please, if you have any questions for Alice, for Janet, for Aliness, as they're that we've had so far, please may you just populate your questions in the chat. Yeah. So we're going to have two polls. So we'll have the first one, which is which kind of support has been most critical for your organization's survival during times of crisis? Please feel free to respond. I think you can select multiple responses, but just to hear how you're timing, what has been most critical for your organization's survival during times of crisis? As said before, the crisis is not new. It's just taking different forms. Yeah. I think the poll is showing. Okay. Let's see. Oh, okay. I hope we have more responses coming in. Yes. I'll give you a little bit more time. Okay. If you haven't introduced yourself in the chat, please do so. Let us know where you're joining us from. We're very happy to have you during the conversation. Okay, so I'm going to end it here. So in terms of the kinds of support that has been most critical for your organization's survival during this time of, or during times of crisis rather, has been unrestricted funding. And this is, and then there's a flat line for all the other options, which is the strong fiscal host intermediary support, solidarity from peer networks, policy and legal support, flexible reporting, and donor terms. But the front line is, the front runner rather, is unrestricted funding. So tied to this as well, we definitely want to have another poll as we prepare to go into our next speaker, Dr. Siphosami Malunga. And in this poll, we okay. So in this one, what is the biggest barrier to shifting power and resources to global South-led civil society? I hope you can see it. It has been launched. Okay. So there we go. What is the biggest barrier to shifting power and resources to global South-led civil society? Donor-driven priorities, legal institutional restrictions, lack of Southern-led platforms, weak coordination among actors. I think some of these have already been touched on by the three speakers we've had so far. But what do you think is the biggest barrier to shifting power and transforming the civic ecosystem? Okay. There we go. Let's see the result. Okay. With this one, we see that the biggest barrier for most on the call, or for those who voted on the poll, has been donor-driven priorities. They think that donor-driven priorities are the biggest barrier to shifting power and resources. And then this is followed by weak coordination among actors. And then lastly, by lack of Southern-led platforms. Thank you so much, colleagues. I think that is interesting. And this is, it also lays the foundation for our next speaker, who is Dr. Siphosami Malunga, who is a Pan-African social justice advocate. He is formerly the programs director at Open Society Africa. Prior to this, he was the executive director at the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa, or CISA. So he's very passionate about social justice. He's passionate about decolonization, and he's very provocative. And I hope that in the next few minutes that we have in, he will provoke us. Thank you. You're welcome, sir.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you, Alice and comrades, for inviting me. It is good to be in your company once again. I've been on a short sabbatical. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay, great. I've been on a short sabbatical, and I must say that it's been very painful to be on a sabbatical at this time, given what has been happening, not just in our region, but around the world. And I actually had to come out of the sabbatical, and I reached out to Alice and I said, Alice, you know, I've come out of my sabbatical and I want to re-engage with comrades. And she said, we have just the opportunity for you to do so. We are talking about the funding landscape and how we can, how we need to rethink and reframe our engagement with it. You know, I spent many years working as on behalf of a funder, not as a funder. I don't have any money of my own, but managing resources for a funder, the Open Society, and supporting activism and social justice in the region. And so I have that perspective, but I also have the perspective of you know, an African, and of course an activist, with a huge sense of abhorrence for injustice, in all its forms. A lot has been said already by comrades, which has taken a lot out of what I wanted to say. So I will focus on just 4 things in trying to unpack this whole concept of how do we reframe power. We need to stop talking about being at the table. The table. That's the first thing, the table, this table. You know, our conversations as social justice advocates have always been around, we need people at the table. We need women at the table. We need young people at the table. We need poor people at the table. We need to stop talking about the table. That's the first thing. Even right now with the Financing for Development conference, it's a table, it's a big table, right? Where eventually the UN managed to get the funders, the rich countries, civil society around the table. It's always about the table. And my provocation is that we need to stop talking about the table. We need to create our own tables. We need to create our own spaces. Because as long as we're expending so much energy to sitting around that table, that energy we need to be using in speaking at our own tables. That's the first point. This table. We need to rethink the concept of this table. And it's happening. It's already happening. We're creating our own spaces, you know, whether it is spaces in Africa, spaces in Asia, it is bringing together Global South, it is optimizing our numbers. We even look at how even some of our countries are reframing this whole table debate. They're creating BRICS. They're saying, no, this IMF, this G7, G20, it's not working for us. Because when you come there, you go with, as President Ramaphosa, you're a guest. You can only sit and watch. What you can say is determined by those already at the table. The size of your chair is determined by those at the table. Where in the table, at the table you sit is determined by those already at the table. The order in which the people at the table speak is determined by already those at the table. So as long as you're trying to get into a table, it's an exercise in futility. That's the challenge, the first one. The second is voice. Voice, the way we've always looked at voice has always been around, I'm waiting for my opportunity to speak. I need to be given an opportunity to speak so that they can hear me. They can hear my voice. But the way we frame voice in our discourse, even as social justice proponents, has always been around, I will get my chance. I need to be there to get my chance. Somebody has to give me a chance to speak. We need to abandon this approach. We need to stop expecting that there will be an opportunity for you to speak. Of course, we frame voice as in whose voices are heard, but it's not just whose voices are heard. There's also the element of who has the opportunity to speak when we are reframing voice, right? So we then focus a lot on being at the spaces where we want to speak. So there is financing for development. We want to be there. UN General Assembly, we want to be there. CSW for our work on gender, we want to be there. COP 2030 now or 31, we want to be there. And we feel a great sense of accomplishment by being there, because we hope if we're there, we then have a chance to speak. We need to, from moving from survival to strategy, we need to shift our focus from wanting to be there in order to be able to speak. Nothing constrains our voice. I know it sounds controversial. We don't need to be at those spaces to speak. We can create our own spaces, as I've said, table, but nothing stops us from speaking in the most creative and innovative ways. We need to speak. And it's not just speaking, of course, it's what it is that we want to say. The third point is priorities. We know, and I'm guilty as well, as a funder in my previous role, you know, whether you're the Open Society or your Ford Foundation, or you are MacArthur, you're Rockefeller, you'll say, this is what we do. This is what we support. We support organizations working on social justice. We support organizations working on democratization, on media expression, etc. So what will happen invariably, or climate change or climate justice, what will happen invariably is that you have set those priorities as the funder. You've set priorities for communities. You, of course, might argue that you've looked at what the issues are and you have decided to streamline what you can fund. But the reality of it is that you are the one setting those priorities, not the communities. This funding crunch, I'll go back to an analogy, which we're all familiar with in our personal lives and also, I guess, as Africans. We will always do what needs to be done. You know, whether as a family, you will always prioritize what needs to be prioritized. You always buy food, regardless of whether you need Wi-Fi. So one of the ways in which we can grapple with the shift is that as resources get less and less and scarcer, it's a fascinating opportunity to reprioritize. You know, when you get money from donors to do certain things, you're going to do them because you have the money to do them. But when you have less and less and less money, let's say you have less and less, but it's unrestricted, you're going to do only what you need to do. So in terms of priorities, I see an opportunity here. Even in this whole, rather awful scenario of, funding retreat, it might very well be the shock. We need to say, what really do we need to be doing? What do we really, because we got money, we got extra money to do climate justice. We really are not a climate justice organization, but we got it from Ford, so we'll do it. Now that there's less and less money, it might be the opportunity to think, what are we really about? we might find that this is the moment to seize and to rethink and to reconsider what we really are about in terms of priorities as organizations, as societies, as countries. Do we really need to be doing that other thing? Or were we doing it because we had money? Are we crying for money that's lost now? That we were doing things that we may not really have needed to be doing. It's another way of thinking about priorities. A very, very important way of thinking about priorities. Now that there's less and less money on the table, what are you really about? Is it okay if those things that you no longer have money for go? Because invariably, that's what we do, even in families. And when there's less money, you just reprioritize. You just do less. You don't get to do everything, but you're still okay. Not, you don't have extra to do the things that you may have wanted to do if you had that money. And the last point, the fourth one, is resources, which is the cause of where we all are now. And my thoughts here are that we have to accept one thing. We are not a basket case of charity. And we need to stop looking at ourselves as such. This money that we've been getting from the different philanthropies, from aid, is our money. So I know that we have a sense of despair and helplessness around these severe cuts. Janet painted a painful picture in Zimbabwe, which I'm familiar with. And we are like, okay, how do we write proposals so that we can get money? How do we shift our priorities? She talked about how people are shifting, how people are depoliticizing their work, how people are moving to areas where donors are still saying they've got money. I know the Scandinavians are out of human rights, they're out of gender, they're out of... So the question is, but the reality is that these are still our problems. These are still real problems. These are still our challenges, in our communities, in our countries. We must not see aid funding as benevolence and charity. We need a defined, as Janet pointed out about the reparations agenda, we need a very defined perspective and approach. This is our money. We must continue to demand not charity, but justice. It's our money. For hundreds of years, our continent has been plundered and looted, and it continues to be right now. You just have to look at DRC, Congo. DRC Congo has, in terms of untapped mineral wealth, 24 trillion United States dollars of minerals in the Congo. Do you know the funding gap? Financing for development. They're projecting the projected funding gap until 2030 is 6 trillion. That's what they're saying. That's what I read. So tell me Africa is poor. Tell me we don't have the money for our own funding. DRC is sitting on $24 trillion of untapped mineral wealth. The global funding gap, that's what they were saying. I was reading this from OECD, is 6 trillion. So DRC could pay for that and still have 18 trillion ready, waiting. And guess what's just happened in the DRC? You all know what's just happened in the DRC. Trump has this $24 trillion. Trump has just taken it all like that. And what has Trump given to the DRC for it? Nothing. The DRC has been set back to the days of Leopold. Back, all the way back. There is no conversation, no debate, no table, no voice, no reform, nothing you can do about that now for the DRC. 24 trillion. South Africa, untapped mineral resources, 2.5 trillion. A third of the gap, the total gap of financial development. So what am I saying, comrades? I'm saying our conversation needs to be one of defiance, one of fighting. We are being plundered. We are being looted. Yes, it manifests in our own spaces. In our own spaces where we're working on social justice, it manifests as, oh, funding crunch, oh, civic space. Yes, that's what it is at that level. But there's money, comrades, in our continent, and it's everywhere. We've got Glencore, we've got Rio Tinto. They're coming here, they're taking everything. They're not paying taxes. Tax justice alone would leverage finance for the continent. Those are the issues we need to be talking about, even if we're not able to do much about it, but we need to be talking about them. We need to be pushing. We need to be pushing our governments to be pushing for better and fairer deals. And that's the argument that Alice made earlier, that we need to move, what was the point she made? Dependency to wealth creation. From dependency to wealth creation, we have the wealth. We have the people. You know, I've always said, every time, I'm going to wind up now. You know, whichever African country you go to, wake up, if you're going to the airport in the morning, because we obviously, when we travel, it's early in the morning, sometimes you're going to the airport, or if you are, you're either driving early in the morning in rural areas, 5 o'clock in the morning, you'll find people already out there working in the field. How are we valuing that resource? How are we valuing that resource? Because we talk about resources, we say we don't have resources, we don't have resources, but what value are we placing on what our own people have to bring to the table? We need to reassess. I know that there's a long debate, and Alice has been at this debate for many years, of care, the value of care work, the contribution of the care economy. We need to value this, because we are acting as if the only money that matters is money that we get from aid, from funders. But money is not value. Completely different things. Our people continue, resilience was the word Janet used. Our people continue with or without money. Our people continue every day to get up, to work, to strive. And in striving, sometimes they actually thrive. And we need to reframe how even our own pitiful, sad, droopy sense of, oh my goodness, what are we going to do now? Oh, hi. No, comrades, no. Our grandfathers, our grandmothers didn't need a grant to fight off colonialism. Our great-grandfathers, they did not need somebody to come and say, hey, here's a grant, Chama Chama Pinduzi, form a party now, fight this colonial. They didn't need that. They sabotaged. They did all the things they needed to do. They fought for their liberation struggles without a penny. So I'll stop there, comrades, and I'll say, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. This is the time to fight. Let's fight with what we have. If it's our voice, let's fight. If it's accountability, let's push. But this is not the time to feel sorry. They are coming for us. They are coming for us. It's not enough for them to withdraw aid and funding. They are coming to take our continent. That's what they are doing. That's what Russia is doing in West Africa and Sahel. That's what America is doing now. That's what China has been doing. And we are going to be left worse off if we don't push, we don't fight back. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As I said before, provocative, but also be the fact this is true. And if you're not provoked, you are not paying attention. But there were very interesting nuggets raised there. The notion, dispelling the notion of, or the obsession of the table. You are the table. You create your table and you own your voice. And what is it that you speak about at this table? What is it you push? What are our priorities? What is it that we really are about? What's our mission? What is it that we're really about as a country? And taking a defiant approach towards reparations. And I think I identified with the droopiness. I was also sad and droopy, but I guess, I think there's definitely more to be said about, that is not the reaction that is required at a time such as this one. I'm going to call upon Dr. Harding. Dr. Harding is the Executive Director of the Social Assistance Trust, and she's a visionary, a strategist, a dynamic leader, and an accomplished fundraiser. Dr. Harding, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's so hard to speak now after all these amazing speakers. I have prepared a presentation in PowerPoint, so I'm going to just go to my slides and then link it into this chat. I hope that works. If it doesn't, I'll just speak from my slides. Let me know if you can see it now.
Not yet on my side, and it's coming through.
It's taking its time. I'm in a guest house in Durban, so can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I was asked to speak on legal empowerment and local leadership through intermediary grant making. And I mean, I must say I've been so impressed by the other speakers and the provocative thoughts that have been put on the table. I'm going to start by just sharing a bit about what SCAT is and what we do, and then some of the challenges that we see or encounter in our work, and also some of the recommendations that I would make for how we should be addressing these. SCAT is a veteran human rights organization. We're an intermediary, and we work with what we call local development agencies to build thriving rural communities. What are local development agencies? Well, for SCAT, these are community-based organizations that are governed and run by the people in their local community who use their unique local knowledge and seek solutions that improve the quality of life of the people living in their communities. They drive inclusive development by collaborating with others, including government, other CBOs, NGOs, philanthropy, religious and traditional leaders, and business. They are conscious of the gender dimensions of development. So SCAT's model of intermediary grant making is both a strategy and a commitment to equity and dignity. Legal empowerment for us means that people know their rights, can claim those rights, and that they can shape the systems that govern them. Local leadership emerges from contextual knowledge and cultural fluency and deep community trust. And local development agencies and their staff who are working as paralegals, community educators, and activists are often the first and only respondents in a time of crisis. These leaders are under-resourced, overstretched, and frequently overlooked in the formal funding spaces. SCAT channels resources to these rural local development agencies that would not normally meet funder thresholds. We provide technical support, compliance, coaching, and mentorship that's rooted in rural realities, and we try and translate donor logic into community strategy and vice versa. We are working on thematic areas of access to justice, gender and the fight against gender-based violence, and food security and climate resilience. So while we provide a lot of technical support in the organizational development of organizations like financial management, governance, fundraising, we also provide technical knowledge in those thematic areas. A lot of the CBOs that we have, or the LDAs that we are funding, some might have a strong focus on access to justice and also be doing some work on climate change or food security or on corruption. So as long as one of the thematic areas that SCAT is trying to work on is what they are focused on, then we would have an interest. Gender and gender equality is never a negotiable for SCAT. For us, the importance of intermediaries is it's about community-driven philanthropy, and it's about shifting the frame from charity to solidarity and from projects to power. Our long-term partnerships, now some of our partners, and we get lots of questions about this, some of our partners have been with us since the early 1980s. So as long as the partners continue to do the work that they said they were going to do, the organizations are relatively well governed, and they are, using the resources that they're given effectively, we will continue to support them. So we have a number of partners that have been with us for the 40 years of our existence. Our long-term partnerships foster trust, and they enable adaptive grant making in response to changing contexts. And we found that, like with the COVID crisis, or when there have been other climate shocks like floods, wildfires, high winds that have affected communities, we've been able to support them to respond quickly. Just recently we had over 100 people die in a flood in the Eastern Cape, and SCAT has been able to respond quickly because we have a strong local partner there, and we are able to put resources into the flood response in the area. Rural organizations don't just need funding, they need companionship in the work of change. The benefits of the SCAT model, for us, we believe it redistributes risk, so grassroots actors can act boldly, knowing that they're supported. We invest in people, not just outputs, and we recognize leadership as infrastructure. Our model builds a civic shield, a networked ecosystem of local justice actors, and it resists extractive funding cycles. Instead of displacing local priorities, it amplifies them. What are the challenges that we're seeing in our role as an intermediary? There definitely has been a decline in donor confidence. And I think the previous speaker mentioned, changes in funders' strategy, the focus areas of funders changing, but also in South Africa, high levels of corruption have meant that donors are skeptical of putting money into the problems that we're facing. Shrinking budgets due to the funds being redirected to humanitarian crises, wars, climate crises, and the protection of borders. And then, of course, I could go endlessly on what is happening in terms of cuts from the US. We also find that with our grantees that there's a high reliance on project funding. So we give core funding, unrestricted core funding, but a lot of the other funding that they get tends to be very restrictive and with very little option of moving between budget lines or shifting priorities as the grant moves on. There's increased compliance demands with high administrative demands, and we're seeing even donors that historically were maybe more relaxed about their compliance demands, shifting towards high compliance. And I was recently in Europe, and the donors were saying, their fear is them being audited by their governments. And so they are preventing the possibility of that kind of audit happening and their own funding being cut. CBOs seen as challenging poor governance or corruption, and as a result they're marginalized or threatened. We're running a project in the Eastern Cape where we are providing funding for CBOs to fight corruption in local government. And many of the CBOs say that they're actually really afraid of this area of work and the danger that it has for their lives. South Africa has an underdeveloped local philanthropy, particularly for rural and social justice work. So we see that a lot of money is still going into higher education or early learning, which is important and necessary work, but it is much harder to mobilize resources for the social justice sector. What do we think needs to happen to shift this? We believe that donors must commit to funding core capacity and long-term organizing. They must support intermediary models that de-risk grassroots funding. Our organization has one program officer to between 10 and 12 grassroots community organizations, whereas you see in big foundations maybe 80 to 100 grantees to one program officer. And that is why we can, we know what's happening. We go to communities, we see the work that's being done. We can be advocates for the work that they're doing. We recognize, or we believe that donors must recognize the political nature of community work and that they must fund accordingly. And they must listen to and co-create with communities and not just audit them. Thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Dr. Harding. Just to reemphasize the community-driven philanthropy approach, which moves from charity to power, and that the crux of this is the valuing of companionship, right? So the strengthening of the relationships between the actors in the ecosystem is actually a strong currency that is also an ingredient in this need for adaptive and agility skills. I think your last slide there was speaking to donors directly and partners, calling for them to offer up unrestricted funding, as that is more responsive and allows for the community to actually grow, the different projects to actually be sustained, a change that is lasting. And then also that co-creation is definitely the way to go in terms of prioritizing what needs to be done and what gets done within the spaces. Thank you for that. I will not administer my call. I'll just call on Lillian on to time. Lillian Tamale is the fund manager at Civic Fund. This is an African-led and managed feminist base providing grant making and fiscal hosting services to civil society in Africa. Lillian, the floor is yours.
Asante. Habari mchana. This is Swahili greeting saying good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here. I realize that I don't know if there are many other East Africans, but looks like I'm representing Thank you very much, Southern African Trust, for having me. So I do work with an organization that does grant making and fiscal hosting. So a lot of what I'm going to be sharing is really from the heart, very personal, lived experiences. And I will be speaking about the power of fiscal hosting and what what is in fiscal hosting in as far as dealing with the current funding crisis is concerned. Let me start at a point that C4 presented very passionately. C4 talked about the table, and he challenged us against always seeking to sit at the table. In fact, what I had him say without saying it was that that table is too small. How about we create our own tables? And so at Civ Fund, we actually decided that we're going to create our own tables, our own table through fiscal hosting. We're going to call the shots. We're going to provide alternative models, and we're going to set a new stage of what grant making should actually be looking like for civil society around Africa. So with the fiscal hosting experience, I would like to just speak to 5 points. The first one, for me, fiscal hosting, especially given the experience that I've had with the Civ Fund over the last 6 years, is that I know that a number of us on this call have been talking about the big buzzword, which is decolonizing aid. You know, decolonizing aid in very many ways includes fundamentally shifting power, moving away from colonial practices and models, also providing agency and leadership to those that we serve. And I think that fiscal hosting is one of those things for me, because I do it on a daily basis, that has provided that model, that has provided a table through which we at Civ Fund decided we are going to, instead of complaining about the models that are not working, the models that are dehumanizing, we're going to create a framework, a funding framework, an infrastructure through which we can get the resources and then move them right to the people who need them in a timely manner with dignity, voice, and agency. And so at Civ Fund, one of the things that we decided we are not going to do, I don't know how many of you on this call love or loved, they call them what? Logical frameworks. I've even started forgetting them, because what we decided at Civ Fund was to say, some of these old things were created by, you know, certain human beings who thought that in order for them to move their money to us, from them to the rest, was to create complicated things, tables that they would want all of us to fit. Over the years, I've been working in the civil society space for the last 20 years. So even before I joined the Civ Fund, I worked for an organization where we used to receive funding, and we had to fill our reports in boxes, in logical frameworks that really didn't make sense. And we all remember the pain of those things, of those logical frameworks. So at Civ Fund, we said, no logical frameworks. Let us think of alternative models. How else can someone how else can someone present what they need to do in a logical way? And we realized that it's simple. You just need to listen to the people, ask them, what do they want to do? How do they want their success to look like? And how will they report about it? And guess what? They are able to report even without logical frameworks. Sorry, I need to get my power on. My battery was running low. Sorry about that. Yeah, so we said that through our funding framework, we are not going to, to ask people to provide logical frameworks, because they do not really make sense to everyone, okay? The second one was to say that we are going to ask people to share very short grant applications. Why? Because we also realized that there was a colonial thought into the complicated grant applications. And we say that through our fiscal hosting infrastructure, as we get money on the table, as we get these funds from the bigger donors from out there, we are telling them we have a model and it's working for us. And you're going to allow us to move your money in a way that looks like us, in a way that makes people feel like they can relate with us. And so through our fiscal hosting infrastructure, we've been able to disrupt a lot of those traditional and colonial ways of thinking. And I think it's Sifo and some other colleagues on the call earlier who said we cannot enough with the whining, enough with the crying. We need to pick up new models that are working and we present them out there. And I think fiscal hosting is the one thing that helps us to tell the world out there, especially for us who do regranting, to say that the moment your money lands on our accounts, then we are going to do it the African way. We are going to allow people to share with us proposals that make sense to them. Some can actually send us videos because that's what they know how to. A lot of Africa is rural. A lot of Africa's civil society is grassroots, and so they are not going to be able to present proposals that may sound as cool as the ones that are received in New York, in London, or anywhere. But we're saying that is a problem. That is a problem that you're facing. We don't have a problem with that. We live in this context, and so through our fiscal hosting infrastructure, we seek to decolonize the way money moves from the ones that have it to the ones that actually deserve it. The second point I'd like to speak to is the fact that, through fiscal hosting, for us at Safe Fund, one of the things, because we are a feminist fund, and for us, fiscal hosting is one of our feminist approaches through which we realize that civil society is not homogeneous. For the longest time, a lot of funding was known to go to organized entities, and I think the ones that they call NGOs, the ones that have chairpersons that look like me and you on this call, the ones that have bank statements, the ones that have 10 years experiences. And we're saying civil society doesn't look like that all the time. In fact, organized civil society is only 23% of the rest of civil society. So NGOs do not equal to civil society. And so we're saying, how do we get the 77% of the other civil society that is not registered, that is a movement, that is a coalition, that are activists, that are individuals? And we said that because this model doesn't make sense to those people who traditionally would give money, we said, if you bring this money to us at Civic Fund as a fiscal host, we are going to use our models to ensure that the rest of civil society that does not look like the organizations you're used to are also able to get grants. So at Civic Fund, a lot of the granting that we do is actually to small grassroots entities. We give grants as small as, I think our smallest grant is $1,000. Yes, $1,000. Why? Because there are communities that come together and all they want is $1,000. And when they engage in their activities for 6 months, their problem is solved. It's also not true, because this is what traditional funding sought to do, which we were trying to decolonize, that all challenges and problems have to be solved over the years. There are certain issues that just need, activists to engage, to come into a space, and after 6 months, by Christmas, they are done. How about those who need short-term grants, small grants? So we do provide small grants using our infrastructure, and we allow our partners to report in ways that make sense to them, including sharing a video. And we're saying, if you give us your money and we're passing it on to our grassroots, we are going to allow them to share the reports the way that they want, because also the reports are also for them. Yes, the reports are also for you as a donor, but we are saying we can use other mechanisms to get for you the message that they want. But if in the end, the engagement is such that a video has been shared and that's it, you're not going to ask us to ask our partners that we have given $3,000 to share with you a 15-page report because it is complicated, because it takes away a lot from them. My third point is, you know, I think almost all my colleagues have talked about it earlier, you know, being context specific. As I think one of the things that I take pride in as a fiscal host at CIFund is the fact that we sit in a space where we do understand. We sit in you know, within Africa. Yes, we may be based in just this one country, but then we have colleagues around the continent. But the point is that how the challenges that we face and how we deal with them is so different from the challenges that people from the Western world face, but also how they deal with them. So the context specificness and the timeliness within which a fiscal host is able to receive this funding and then pass it on to people who, I think a couple of you have had this narrative about, there are many traditional donors, big traditional donors, who say two things. One, they say that certain organizations are risky. You know what that means? They're saying they're risky because they are not registered. And we are saying we're working in contexts within Africa where sometimes being registered becomes part of the problem. I remember the first call was about, they were asking us some questions about some of the challenges that have affected our ways of doing. And one of the responses was, you know, the political situations within our country. So we are saying sometimes some of the efforts that have to be supported actually shouldn't be registered. In fact, it is a strategy. So if people are going to come together in movements, in coalitions, and you know that they are fighting against certain forms of injustices that are going to lead them down, you know, a hole of trouble, what do you do? So we realize that actually we need to leave room to move money to those organizations that don't have to be registered. They don't have to all look like us, okay? So those who are registered, you know, they have all the framework, well and good. But for those that are not, we're saying we're not leaving anyone behind. In any case, it is a feminist approach. And finally, just to speak to one of the things that for us has guided our fiscal hosting ways of doing an infrastructure, we have come to the realization that fundraising is indeed a political game. You know, just like any other game or sport, not all of us are good at this. I don't know how many men are here and how many of you on the call know how to play football. If we go to the pitch, usually you get the best, and they are the ones who go to represent you as a country or as a team. So fundraising is not a thing for everyone. There are entities out there who are passionate about the work that they are doing. There are entities that are very close to communities, especially rural communities. And we're asking ourselves, how are those organizations, how are those entities going to access this funding? Because remember, like I said at the beginning, the funding infrastructure has systematically left them out. So how do we get them onto this table, the one that we have now created? How do they get access to this funding? And so we said through our fiscal hosting infrastructure, we are going to use our models to reach out to what some people call the, you know, underserved, or, you know, the most at risk, the ones that don't look like us. You know that many civil society actors out there cannot even log on to this call. Can you imagine? But it is the truth. So how do we get into their spaces? So for us, we then say we want to use our models to get those funding, the funding within our funding infrastructure, and we move that money to them. And when we move it to them, we are able to then do the reporting. We do the heavy lifting. We are the ones who answer the question. In fact, sometimes I think as fiscal hosts, one of the things that we need to bear in mind is that we have a responsibility, a social responsibility to push back on some of these things. There are conversations that CFund, that the Trust, and many other organizations that are doing the work that we are doing, there are conversations that we can get into. We can push back, and we need to push back. There are some other organizations which, when they challenge a donor, funding is gone. Okay? So to be able to appreciate the privilege and the power that we have in this space, and at CFund, this is one of the things that we have taken on seriously and passionately, to say that in spaces where we need to push back as a fiscal host, we have been able to actually push back and demand that if you can't do certain things right, look out for what you call the intermediaries. I like, I think it was Alice who said, someone's just actually the main, but look out for the local funders, the fiscal hosts, the people who do regranting, the people who know how to speak to certain people in their languages, the people who know how to relate with them. Look out for them, pass on that money, and make sure that that money is later passed on with dignity and with voice and agency. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lillian. Thank you for sharing the practical ways you as CFund are working as a decolonizing mechanism, that your approaches are flexible, and that you've over the years developed an infrastructure that preserves dignity, voice, and agency. But most importantly, it's actually taking a stand. You're taking charge of your social responsibility to actually push back. So it's also a form of defiance. It's also a form of resistance as well, protecting our table and our voice, so to speak. So thank you so much for sharing and shedding more light on how you work and how it's been valuable. And I think there are a lot of reactions as well in the chat, Lydia, and if you can also look at those, there's very much appreciation. We've reached the stage where we can have some question and answers from our speakers. So I've had a look at the questions that have been put forward, and I've selected two in the interest of time, but these two are more or less similar. And so I definitely like to call upon our presenters to address, or rather speak to, provide some pointers for Leslie Mudimu from Harare. And the question is, given the difficulties in the development space, some have said shifting to a social enterprise model might be ideal to deal with the current shift in funding. And then along the same lines, Tambundoro is also asking, what steps would an organization or country office need to take to integrate elements of the fourth sector model? Then she describes the fourth sector model as using market-based approaches to create sustainable solutions, blending philanthropy and commerce to address complex challenges. Speakers, are there any takers for those two questions? But they can be responded to as one. Okay.
Let me try, Rachel.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you.
I think colleagues, we have got stuck over the years. We've got stuck in binaries, right? We've got so stuck in binaries that there's something wrong with trying to make money or generate income and wealth. There's absolutely nothing. Alice talked about this. What are the forms? She mentioned wealth creation. How do we move from dependency to wealth creation? We've got to find the opportunities to make our own money. And if there are opportunities to make money in the spaces where we are, we need to make the money. And we are quite deliberate and intentional in why we need to make the money. All right? Right now, we are subsisting from money that people made somewhere. And some of them, as a matter of fact, decided, in order to cleanse their own souls, to give away some of the money. Some were driven by values, a real sense of trying to do good, give back, but some are really just cleansing their own consciences. But the money is still the money, and the money is still good. And the money will still do what we need it to do, as long as we are responding to real challenges, real needs, real priorities that our people have. So my answer is a very simple one. Our communities are so innovative, so adept. So, I mean, my late mother was in a burial society that she contributed all her life, right? Until she died at 83 years old. That burial society always had money, right? Even as the downturn of the Zimbabwean economy, they would still, even if they could jump 2-3 months of not contributing, they still contribute. You still find after a few months, you skipped, and then, or sometimes when you don't have, somebody else pays for you. What am I saying, comrades? What I'm saying is that we cannot just kill over and die. Stock fell. The highest growing investment in South Africa is Stokvel. People coming together and contributing a certain amount of money. Some Stokvels have hundreds of millions of dollars or rands. Imagine, okay, that's the second one. Remittances. Remittances constitute the largest injection of money in many of our economies in Africa now. Of course, now that's why Trump now wants to tax remittances. You know, he wants to tax them, which means that there will be fewer remittances now. 6%, but the cost of even sending money to our continents, 6% is too high. It's too high. There's somewhere where we can fight. Imagine if we were to have a fight to reduce the cost of remittances. How much more money would be available to our communities? But imagine if we had programs that seek to harness collectively this money that people are contributing. I was part of an interesting, I don't want to say too much about it, but I'll say this and then stop. I was part of an interesting initiative recently. It's around a democratic process where people in the diaspora, quite innovative, is how do you prick somebody's conscience to make a contribution to a collective effort, right? And the contribution might be $20 or $5. The way Action Aid has always done it, you know, sponsor a child, these are models that they've done. Amnesty International membership drives, etc., etc. But how do we harness? And I'm looking for this. How do we harness the power of the money our people are bringing into our continent and our communities? As the social justice sector, given that we know that it is a lot of money that's coming in, it is so much more than even some of our countries are generating. I've yet to see a plan from the social justice sector to harness that. And I'll give you a suggestion. In one recent election in one country, there was an initiative that said you can sponsor a transparent process in your polling station. Your polling station. It becomes personal because you want you know the candidate in your polling station, you know the families, you know the community. You would like the election in your polling station or your area to be as free, as fair, as transparent, as peaceful as possible. You're sitting in London, you're sitting in Osaka, in Japan, you're sitting in Rio de Janeiro. You are animated about what's going on back in your country. You would like to be involved, and you know you can be with $20. But the framing for that has been done. For that to be possible, somebody's contributing somewhere else, somebody's contributing, but collectively, you are all in the diaspora making a meaningful contribution to the freeness and fairness and peacefulness of that election. It's just an example. So that's my answer. Let's make the money if we can. Let's work on agri-enterprises if we can. Let's support organizations that are generating income. There's no shame in that. They want us not to make our own money so that we continue to depend on them.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Can I come in, Rachel?
Yes, you may.
All right. And I agree with you entirely, C4. But also to respond, there's a question from Leslie Mudimu. She's joining in from Harare in Zimbabwe. And Leslie's asking about the social enterprise model. So I think for me, one of the things that we also have taken on at Civ Fund, as we do our fiscal hosting and taking advantage of the power that we know we now hold in the faces of many donors, as we negotiate for any funding relationship, we have told all our donors that we need the partners that we are going to work with, whether it's a donor advised fund, where you have already decided your which partners to work with, or whether Civ Fund is going to pick them up, is to take them through what we call a financial resilience trainings. And by financial resilience, this is one of the ways of, one of the forms of social enterprises, because we realize that many organizations, particularly in East Africa, were confused about whether or not organizations can make money. The truth of the matter is that in all our laws, NGOs, civil society organizations can actually make money. The point is that this money should then be plowed back to the priorities of the organization. So for every small grant that comes from Civ Fund to our partners, we start them with the safest ways of unit trusts, for example. Many of us on this call, especially those who come from the civil society background and fraternity, are not used to business. We're used to burning money. We're used to receiving $1 million in January, and by November, December, you have a burn rate of 95. There, you're doing well. Meanwhile, there's not even one saving, but not because it is our fault, because the donors are not even allowing us to do that. And so we have taken on the position to challenge this narrative. And we're telling these donors, we need to put a percentage, 5%, and we tell all our partners, before you figure out what you need to do, because this is not something you know how to do, put it on a unit trust. Unit trusts, and I think the general conversation across Africa, fetch anywhere between 9 to 11%, and let that your money. Imagine a partner has $1 million. It doesn't even have to be $1 million. $200,000 seated on an account from January. Can you imagine? That's poverty. Even from January, 200,000 US dollars by December will make $20,000. Can you imagine? And so we have taken all our partners through this to tell them, before you figure out the bigger social enterprise models that will finally work for you, let us start there. Fix your money, put it on a unit trust. And of course, like I said, our role is to push back, because there are donors who can listen to the trust. There are donors who are going to listen to Civ Fund, but they are not going to listen to the small partners. So we take that space and advocate for some of these things to happen. And we are seeing organizations grow financially so that when this funding comes to an end, they have something that can continue to sustain their efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Lillian. Alice, you can take the mic, but just for a minute.
Sure. I won't be long. In fact, I really just wanted to agree with what Sipho said, and I think Lillian has already even provided examples. But what I really think it is more a mindset shift that we need in the sector. And that is what I meant when I said we need to deconstruct how we've been positioned and how we've also accepted how we've been positioned in the civic and development sector. I think the idea that, you know, development work is supposed to be funded through donor funding is a mindset that many of us who've been in the sector have kind of just accepted as a norm, and we've normalized it. And Sipho and Lillian are right that we really need to, and it's a mental shift that we need, and to invest in that so that we can all really begin to think of this work as work that is very much a part of us and can be funded by us from our own enterprise, from our own, you know, resourcing. So I really think, and that is part of that idea of deconstructing how we've been positioned in the sector and how we've actually accepted that is the norm. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you for that. We have reached the limit of our meeting, the time allocation that we expect. We've had very robust discussions and thought-provoking insights from our speakers. We just want to appreciate them. You're welcome to show them some love with your reactions on your taskbar. But thank you so much for sharing your experiences, your knowledge, and also for triggering some, triggering thought processes for us to start to reimagine and also deconstruct come out of our set ways and learn some of these mindsets that have contributed to us feeling stuck. We are not stuck. We seem stuck, but we are not. From the trust, we can commit that we will be sharing the recording of the webinar together with a few takeaways from the speakers, as well as from the questions as well. And there were a lot of comments that came in from the audience as well around, agreeing and also adding more thoughts into the pot. And so this has been a very, very insightful time together. Thank you very much. And if you haven't responded to the poll, please do so. It is being deemed, it is showing. Please let us know what kind of follow-up you would find most useful after this webinar. We've started a great process, and I'd like to call this our space with our voice. So this is our soft voice. So thank you very much. You are welcome to leave. If you'd like to hang around, type in some of your sentiments and thoughts, you're welcome to do so. Thank you very much, and have a great day further.
And thank you so much, Rachel, for holding the space for all of us. Excellent facilitation. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Absolutely.
Indeed. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Alice. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
for
you.
inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alice. It was great being here.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.